Shalom everyone, and welcome to our series on Sefer Bereishit. I'd like to begin by explaining why this series is not a shir on Parashat hashavua. It will be a weekly class that relates to the weekly Parsha in Sefer Bereishit, but we're going to be studying the theme of Sefer Bereishit, not the theme of Parashat Shavua. I'll try to explain why. Actually, it's very simple. God gave us Sefer Bereishit. He didn't give us Sefer Bereishit divided into Parashat Shavua. Thousands of years later, in the Babylonian exile, a beautiful custom developed that the Jews would read the Torah portion every week, and in the weekly division of the parashot, we finished once a year. That's where we're beginning our series with after Simchat Torah, when we begin Sefer Bereishit every year. But no one composed or wrote Parashat Noach or Parashat Va'era or Parashat Chayesar, etc. Rather, we took Sefer Bereishit, and we have to divide it into sections of about 100 verses each. And you can ask the question, why did the rabbis start the weekly section here and end there, but no one composed the Parsha by itself? On the other hand, Sefer Bereishit is a composition we received from God himself that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. That's exactly where I want to begin, and I want to make, maybe you might call it a bold assumption. If I'm looking for a theme of Sefer Bereishit, I have to consider who was the original audience. Of course, the book is given for all generations, but it was given at a specific time in Jewish history. If I follow our tradition, the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, and Rashi makes a very interesting comment in Shemot 24:7, in the famous pasuk when it says, "Vayikach Moshe et Sefer HaBrit." Moshe takes the book of the covenant, Vayikra bo Znei Ha'am, he reads to the ears of the people, and the people answer, Naseh v'nishma, and that's when the Jewish people enter a covenant at Har Sinai. All the commentators are wondering, what is this Sefer HaBrit? What is this book of the covenant that Moshe is reading to the people? Rashi comments, Sefer Bereishit. Now, what exactly Rashi is referring to, you can argue, but it's telling me that the original purpose of Sefer Bereishit is to explain to a nation that went through suffering and bondage in Egypt, who just went through redemption in a miraculous way, is about to enter a covenant with God at Har Sinai, about to take that covenant and form a nation in the land of Israel representing God. Assuming that that is the original audience of Sefer Bereishit, then I want to understand how the book of Sefer Bereishit explains to the Jewish people where they're coming from, who their God is, where they're going to, what's the purpose of that covenant, and basically, why are there 12 tribes? Why do we suffer in Egypt? Who's this God who's taking us out of Egypt? What's the goal of our nation? How do we relate to other nations? Again, the book will do it through a story, but my assumption throughout this entire series is the book of Bereishit was given to Am Yisrael to explain to them why they were chosen. Again, what's the purpose of the chosenness, where they're coming from, where they're going to. In light of that, we're going to study Sefer Bereishit. Now, when you look at the book as a whole, there's no doubt it divides into two clear sections. There's the universal section, which is the first 11 chapters or so, which deal basically with all humankind at the same time. And then God chooses Avram Avinu, and then we begin the particular section where God chooses a Jewish people, and which people will be chosen, which offspring of Avram Avinu. The filtering process, that will be the second half of the book. But what I want to focus on today, this week and next week, is what's the purpose of the universal section? Why do I need to know about creation? Why do I need to know about Adam and the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Hevel, the story of the flood, the story of the Tower of Babel? Those big four stories that begin Sefer Bereishit before Avram is chosen, how do they help us understand the purpose of our chosenness? The topic I want to focus on today is a theme of names. The word in Hebrew for a name is a shem, shin mem, which in English could be translated as a name or also as a reputation. If you remember, in Kohelet, Tov Shem is Shem and Tov, a good reputation is better than very fine oil. Where do we find the word Shem in this week's Parsha? It doesn't seem to be a major theme, but ever since day one, it's been something important, because from day one, in fact, day 1, 2, and 3, God creates first the light, and then the heaven and the earth, the sky, the seas, vegetation. But each day, God gives out names. He names, or the light, he calls it day. He names the night. he names the rakia, the shamayim, he names the heavens, the amim, the seas, he names the yabasha, he calls it aretz. God is giving out names to whatever he creates. That might just be incidental, or something might be developing. Because when we get to chapter 2, and man is put in Gan Eden, one of the first jobs that man is given, besides to take care of the garden, is as follows. I'm reading in Perek Bet in Parashat Bereishit, Pasuk Yudchet, chapter 2, verse 18. Vayomer Hashem Elohim, lo tov heyot ha'adam levado, eseh lo ezer kenegdo. It's not good for man to be alone. He needs a helper. He needs a companion. Vayitzer Hashem Elohim min ha'adama kol chayat hasadeh v'et kol hashamayim, v'yaveh el ha'adam lirot ma yikra lo, v'chol asher yikra lo ha'adam nefesh chaya hu shmo. What does man do? God presents before man a whole range of different animals that he created. In fact, it seems like God is creating the animals for the sake of man. And then verse 20, Pasuk Kaf, Vayikra ha'adam shemot l'chol ha'behema l'of ha'shamayim l'chol chayat hasadeh u'l'adam lo matzah ezer kenegdo. Man gives out shemot, man gives out names to all the animals. Now, I'm pretty sure that he's not giving proper names or personal names to each animal. Rather, he's naming the species. What gives man the ability to realize, hey, there's a group of animals, they're all, let's say, call them dogs, and these are horses, and these are lambs, and these are sheep, and these are cows, etc., and these are reptiles, and these are birds, and these are fish, etc. What gives man that ability to recognize that there's patterns in nature, there's groups of nature, and there's organization in nature? That's part of his wisdom, of course, that comes hand in hand with the tree of knowledge. Man has the ability, the way God made man, he has the ability to realize there are species, and it could be that that ability of man to find patterns in nature, and there must be some logic behind the hierarchy of nature and the groups of nature, maybe ultimately that process of organizing and categorizing might lead him to the conclusion about a relationship with God. We'll see how that's going to develop later in the parsha. But in the meantime, man is looking for companionship. Of course, he will need companionship with God, but man is different than animal. And that's what's probably most important, and that ties us back from chapter 2 back to chapter 1. God makes man in his image, b'tselem Elokim. Everything that God does in the story of creation begins with Vayomer Elokim. God gives a command that something should be created. He plans to do something, and then he executes that command. He does what he said he was going to do, and then he evaluates. We like to refer to that as power. He plans, he acts, and he reflects. The last creation of God on day 6 is a creation in God's image, because what was Elohim doing every day? He was planning, creating, and reflecting. That process of creation ends in day 6. God rests on day 7. The last thing that God created was man in God's image, b'tselem Elokim. That's going to be a major theme throughout Sefer Bereishit. And therefore, man has to appreciate his ability to be creative, to analyze, to make new things, and to reflect upon them. That is not only a gift from God, but a responsibility to be in charge of God's creation and use his creativity properly. So the very process of man realizing he's different than animal. In fact, if you look at the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, when he tries to define what is the meaning of Tzelem Elokim, what he says basically is, it's hard to define, but whatever the difference is between man and animal, that's your Tzelem Elokim. Take the sum total of man, subtract from that the sum total of animal, what you're left with is Tzelem Elokim. Therefore, when man realizes not only that there are different animals and different species, but humans are totally different than animals. There's something unique about being a human that's different than an animal. That should lead man to realize he's created in God's image, and that understanding should lead him to a relationship with God, to appreciate his creativity, to thank God for that creativity, but to use it properly and learn how to reflect. Now, in light of that idea, let's continue to a very interesting section in Parashat Bereishit, the story of Cain and Hevel. Their names must be important. I'll try to explain why. Let's look how Perek Dalet begins. It begins, V'adam yada et Chava ishto, v'atar v'telet et Cain, v'atomer kaniti ish et Hashem. Cain is given a name that relates to the understanding of Chava, that she did it together with God. But if you want to take a partnership idea, Chava says, I'm 90%, God's 10%. I own the child, kaniti. I bought this child, I own him. Like a kinyan, when you make something, you own it. And therefore, Cain is someone, he's a doer, he's creative, but he takes that as, maybe might see it as a gift of God, but he's in charge of that creativity power. We have no explanation for the name of his brother. We're told his brother was born, his name is Hevel. Remember, Hevel is a shepherd, Cain is a farmer. Again, farmer is much more active. And then, of course, the famous story, each one brings an offering to God, and God accepts Hevel's and not Cain's. They get into a fight without getting to what's behind that story. But when the story ends, of course, Hevel is murdered by his brother. The story should end in verse 25. Let me explain why. Remember how chapter 4 began? We were told that Adam yadat Chava ishto, and he gave birth to Cain and gave him a name. Look at verse 25 in chapter 4, Perak Dalet Pasuk Chafei. After the story of Lemech and his 3 sons, etc., and after what he did, then we're told at the end, Vayeda Adam od et ishto vateled ben vatikrat shmo Shet, ki shat li Elohim zer acher tachat hevek yogor Cain. That would be a perfect ending of the story. The unit began with V'adam yadat Chava ishto, man knew his wife and gave birth to the first child Cain, and then Hevel, and then what happened? When that's over, now that Hevel is gone and Cain went sort of in a bad direction, Adam and Chava decide to have another child, the parallel language, Veda Adam Odet Ishto Vateled Ben, and now Chava gives a different name. She calls this child Shet, Vatikrat Shmo Shet, Kishat li Elohim Zeracher Tachat Hevek Yogor Cain. God gave me this seed, God gave me this child, and that's replacing Hevel because Cain killed him. I have almost perfect closure of the opening line. The first child, Chava thought she was 90%, God 10%. Now this third child, after the second child was murdered by his brother, now God gave me this child, God's 90% and I'm 10%. And his name is Shet. Reflecting the idea that God gave me this child, I give all the credit to God. The parak in this unit could end right here. For some reason, we're told one more generation. Let's read now verse 26, the last line of chapter 4, which is a sort of a cliffhanger in Sefer Bereishit. And I want to build my theme of Sefer Bereishit from this line. Again, chapter 4 begins with Adam knowing his wife, giving birth to Cain, and then Adam knowing his wife again, giving birth to Shet. I can end right here, perfect closure, because another child, because replacing Hevel, because Cain killed him. But then we're told, Shet gam hu yulad ben, vayikrat shmo Enosh. Shet had a child, his name was Enosh. Az huchal likro b'shem Hashem. It's very difficult to translate this last phrase. I'll repeat it again in Hebrew. Az huchal likro b'shem Hashem. Most English translations understand huchal as to begin. At that time, in the time of Enosh, man began to invoke God by name. It sounds like something very positive, and for some reason, during the life of Enosh, humankind, whoever was living at the time, began to turn to God. Were they turning to God in prayer, developing a relationship with God? Were they talking about God? Were they talking to God? Very unclear. Rashi follows Chazal and understands huchal not to begin, but to debase, or to lashon chilul, to defile. What happened? Man began to defile God's name. In fact, the Rambam in the laws of Avodah Zarah, in the very first halacha in the laws of Avodah Zarah, in Sefer Hamada, what does he tell us? He tells us that idol worship began in the time of Enosh, and quotes exactly this verse, that in the time of Enosh, man began to, everyone realized God created the sun and the moon, but they thought the sun had their own powers and the moon, and all the things that God created had their own power, and they were on their own, and they forgot God and started worshiping the different things that God made, and that led to idol worship, worshiping the sun, the moon, all the different powers of nature. What's important for our class today is the fact that it's unclear what's going on. Chumash is leaving the reader with a big question mark. We're ending a topic that has nothing to do with Cain and Hevel. But for some reason, we're told that, again, the third son, Shet, had another son, Enosh. We'll find about that whole genealogy later on in the next chapter anyhow. And then we have this cliffhanger, Az tuchal likro b'shem Hashem. That phrase, likro b'shem Hashem, if it never came up again in Sefer Bereishit, I'd still have a question mark, which direction to go in. But when we get to the main topic of Sefer Bereishit, with Avraham Avinu being chosen, what do we find? We find that exact same phrase. And here I'm going to state my basic assumption, is that Chumash is a book to study and not read. Chumash doesn't spill the beans and say, here's my message. Rather, Chumash is a book you have to study. You don't read and here's the message, but rather, you study the book, you analyze the book, you look at patterns, you look at development of theme, key words, structure, etc. And through that study, you slowly can search for what message God's trying to give us in the book. When Avram is chosen in chapter 12, remember he's told to make Aliyah from Ur Kasdim. He comes to Eretz Canaan, and first he comes to Shechem. What's the highlight of Avraham Avinu's first Aliyah to the land of Israel? In Sefer Bereishit again, in chapter 12, in verse 8, V'yatek misham Mahara, he continues traveling from the mountain range, from Shechem, arrives in Beit El, Beit Olo, Beit El from the west, the Ai from the east. Then we're told, Vayiven sham mizbeach l'Hashem, vayikra b'shem Hashem. There he builds an altar for God, and he calls out in God's name. Again, there's an argument among the commentators. Did Avram pray? Did he call it to God? Rashi and Unklus, or follow Ramban, he called out about God. He began to spread the concept of God, of God's reputation, to the people surrounding him. So this phrase, Vayikra b'shem Hashem, which we find in the very beginning in the story of Avraham Avinu, in chapter 12, seems to be parallel and shed light on what was happening in the end of chapter 4, in the time of Enosh, as tuchal likro b'shem Hashem. So maybe this last line of chapter 4 in Parashat Bereishit is setting the stage for the underlying theme of Sefer Bereishit to understand why we're chosen to be God's people. Avram afterwards goes down to Egypt due to the famine. When he returns from Egypt in chapter 13, what are we told? He returns from Egypt. He goes right back to the same place he was before. Again in chapter 13, verse 3. Yud Gimel Gimel. To the same place where he pitched his tent between Beit El and Ai. The same altar that he made beforehand when he first came. And again, there Avram calls out in God's name. In fact, when Avram isn't doing anything special, when there's not fighting wars or making covenants with God, what is Avram doing basically? His way of life? He's making a name for God. If you remember for the Torah reading on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, after many interactions with Abimelech, the king of the Plishtim, Abimelech wants to make a treaty with Avraham Avinu. They make that treaty in Beersheba. They set aside the 7 lambs. And then we're told, Vaita Eshel beBeersheba, in the end of chapter 21, he plants an Eshel in Beersheba. And what does he do there? Vaikra Sham b'Shem Hashem Kolam. There he calls out in the name of God, the eternal God. And therefore we see from the beginning of Avram's career to the end of his career, he's making a name for God. How do you make a name for God? By how you talk, by how you act, how you interact with other people, how you relate your actions, your understanding to the existence of one God. And that's going to begin the story of the Jewish people. So what I want to suggest is that Sefer Bereishit is setting the stage for the rest of, what I want to suggest is that Parashat Bereishit is setting the stage to appreciate why God is picking Avraham Avinu, because the goal of Sefer Bereishit is to explain to Am Yisrael why they're chosen. Again, I was claiming the original audience might have been the nation coming out of Egypt, but because that nation is chosen forever, the book is written also for all generations as well. And therefore, when I'm developing this theme of the story of creation, already in the story of creation, I'm having key themes that are going to develop later in the book. Now, as we mentioned, the end of chapter 4 ends with a sort of, again, I call this a cliffhanger. We don't know what's going on. Azu chal likro b'shem Hashem. In chapter 5, at the end of Parashat Shavua, Parashat Bereishit, we get Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam, and then we get all the genealogies from Adam to Noach. We have 10 generations, as we're all familiar with. The last generation, remember, each one follows the same pattern He gave birth to a son. He lived this amount of years beforehand and afterhand, and he had the total amount of years, and then had many children. Let's take a look at the end of chapter 5. Lemech, the last of the genealogies. Lemech lives X amount of years, and he gives a son. His name is Noach. Noach, we find a reason for his name. Remember, Noach is the first child born after Adam Rishon died, if you do the math. And therefore, he's calling him Noach, hoping that the curse of the land that was caused by Adam Rishon will be fixed. And therefore he says, hopefully this child will fix the curse from the time of Adam Rishon. Then we're told that Lemech lived 500 years, etc., and he had children. Now, Noach then now lives 500 years, and what are we told? Instead of only one child, Noach has 3 sons. Vayiled Noach, and Shem et Cham et Yafet. And then we have the rest of the story that leads into the story of the flood. Now, Yafet is a beautiful name for a child. Cham, not exactly sure what it means, but you could say maybe it was the hottest name at the time, or it's a word that sort of makes sense. In fact, I think it might mean servant in Egyptian. There are different theories about that. But what's interesting, why name a child Shem? It's like the most boring name possible. Usually a name, you give someone a name. Why would Noach call a son Shem? So we'll develop already this Mirza Shem and Ashir on Parashat Noach. What I want to suggest is Parashat Bereishit is ending with Noach's 3 children who are going to be the continuation of civilization. After the flood, they're going to survive. Noach waited a long time till he had children, probably waited till he found out about the flood coming, and he decides to name maybe his first child or most important child, Shem, because he wanted that son to make a name for God. That we'll try to develop when we study next week's Parsha. But what I want to summarize today is, in the story of creation, I'm beginning a theme of a name for God. The idea of Shem Hashem, it's a central theme all through our prayer service. If you remembered from our Malchiyot and the Rosh Hashanah davening, not only declaring God as king, but reminding ourselves He's our boss, He chose us to serve Him. So it's our duty to praise God, to talk about God. But what are we hoping for? We're hoping that all humankind will recognize God through our behavior. Hopefully that will help facilitate that. Okay. And then everyone will call God in God's name. As we say in the second paragraph, this theme of calling out in God's name, making a name for God by how we talk and how we act, and bringing this concept of creation of one God, who created man with the ability, with the blessing of creativity, but also the ability to do good and unfortunately to do evil, but to reflect on his behavior and try his best to take his creativity and do good and sanctify God in his day-to-day life. That is going to be one of the key challenges of the Jewish people. God is going to enter a covenant with the people to be the model nation, to follow that behavior. In next week's share, we'll try to see how the story of the flood will help develop that theme and set the stage for God choosing Avram Avinu. Everyone should have a wonderful day.